I've spent decades looking into the eyes of people who are lost, people who are hurting, and people who are so buried under their own lies they wouldn't know the truth if it bit them on the nose. But every now and then, a case comes across my desk. It makes even me take a long, hard pause before I walk out onto that stage. This was one of those cases. It wasn't just about a mother and a daughter who couldn't get along. It was about the toxic chemistry of a relationship where the roles had been flipped so many times that neither one of them knew which way was up. You see, when a mother tells the world that her daughter is ruining her life, people usually listen. They offer sympathy. They assume the child is the problem. But my job isn't to listen to the story people want to tell. My job is to look at the story they're trying to hide. Diane walked into my studio with the air of a woman who had been through a war. She had that practiced, weary look, the heavy sigh, the slumped shoulders, the way she clutched her handkerchief like it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. Her daughter, Sarah, sat 3 feet away from her on that stage, and the distance between them felt like 1,000 miles. Sarah didn't look like a girl who was ruining anyone's life. She looked like a girl who had been hollowed out from the inside. She was guarded, her arms crossed tight over her chest, eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't making a scene. She was just gone. And that's usually the first red flag I look for. Rage is one thing. It means there's still some fire left. Silence? Silence is what happens when the fire has been smothered for far too long. When Diane started talking, the words came out in a polished stream of grievances. She told me Sarah was ungrateful, that she was aggressive, that she had spent years making Diane's life a living hell with her moods and her uncontrollable behavior. Diane painted a picture of herself as the long-suffering martyr who had given everything for a child who gave nothing back. She used words like vicious and abusive to describe a 20-year-old girl who looked like she was trying to disappear into the upholstery of my chair. Diane was good. She was very good. She had a way of framing her own actions as responses to Sarah's attacks. It's a classic move in the narcissist playbook. You hit someone until they cry, and then you tell the world they're unstable because they're crying. I sat there, listening, letting her talk. I've learned that if you give people enough rope, they'll eventually tie their own knots. I watched the way Diane looked at me, seeking validation, seeking a partner in her condemnation of her daughter. She wanted me to be the hammer she used to nail Sarah to the wall. But I was looking at the files. I was looking at the history. I was looking at the things Diane was carefully omitting from her narrative. You see, you don't get to Sarah's level of shutdown without a reason. Children don't just wake up one day and decide to ruin their parents' lives for the fun of it. There is always a catalyst. There is always a root, and usually that root is buried deep in the soil of the home they grew up in. As I began to dig, the facade started to crack, just a little. I asked Diane about Sarah's childhood. I asked about the early years. Diane gave me the Hallmark version: birthday parties, school plays, the perfect family. But when I turned to Sarah and asked her what she remembered, the silence in the room became deafening. Sarah didn't look at her mother. She didn't even look at me. She just said, "I remember waiting." When I asked her what she was waiting for, she said for the other shoe to drop, for her to decide if she loved me that day or if I was the reason she was unhappy. That's a heavy burden for a child to carry, the responsibility for a parent's emotional state. That's what we call parentification, and it's one of the most subtle, damaging forms of emotional abuse there is. I could see Diane's jaw tighten. She didn't like where this was going. She quickly jumped back in, redirecting the conversation to a recent incident where Sarah had allegedly screamed at her in a grocery store. She wanted to stay in the present. She wanted to stay focused on Sarah's symptoms rather than the disease that caused them, but I wasn't going to let her do that. I've seen this movie before. A parent comes on this show wanting me to fix their kid, which is code for make them compliant so I can keep treating them however I want without them complaining. That's not how it works. You can't fix the fruit if the tree is poisoned. I started looking into the what she did part of the story. The research team had found things Diane hadn't mentioned in her application. There were police reports from years ago, not for Sarah, but for Diane. There were history of disappearances where Diane would leave Sarah alone for days at a time when she was just a young teenager, only to return and blame Sarah for not checking on her or caring enough about where she was. This is the ultimate gaslighting. To abandon a child and then blame the child for the abandonment is a level of psychological warfare that most people can't even fathom. It creates a reality where the victim is convinced they are the victimizer. Diane tried to brush it off. I was struggling, she said, her voice dropping into that soft, manipulative register. I was a single mother. I had nobody. Sarah should understand that. I looked her dead in the eye and told her, a child is not an emotional support animal, Diane, and they certainly aren't a scapegoat for your own failures as an adult. The audience was quiet. You could feel the tension shifting. The narrative Diane had carefully constructed was starting to bleed. Sarah finally looked up. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was recognition. It was the moment someone finally says out loud what you've known in your gut for 20 years but were told was a lie. I've always said that you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Diane was miles away from acknowledgement. She was still in the deny and deflect phase. She started listing all the money she had spent on Sarah, all the clothes she had bought her, as if you can buy back the trauma of emotional neglect with a pair of designer jeans. It's a common tactic for parents who fail on an emotional level. They try to overcompensate on a material level so they can point to the receipts and say, see, I'm a good parent. But kids don't remember the shoes. They remember the screaming. They remember the cold shoulder. They remember the way you made them feel like they were a burden just for existing. I leaned forward, my hands clasped, and I asked Sarah a very specific question. Sarah, what is the one thing your mother did that you can't get past? The one thing she never tells people when she's telling them you're ruining her life? Sarah's hands started to shake. She looked at Diane, who was staring at her with a look that wasn't maternal, it was predatory. It was a warning. It was a look that said, don't you dare tell the truth. But Sarah had been silent for 20 years, and the pressure was finally becoming too much to contain. The air in the studio felt thick, like we were all waiting for a dam to burst. I knew right then that we weren't just doing a TV show anymore. We were performing an autopsy on a dying relationship. Sarah took a breath, and it sounded like a rattle in her chest. She looked at Diane, and for a split second, I saw that little girl again, the one who was terrified of making a mistake, the one who had been trained to protect her mother's secrets at the expense of her own soul. Diane didn't move. She didn't reach out. She just sat there with this cold, stony mask of a face, waiting to see if her daughter would finally break the unspoken code of silence that had governed their lives. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper but echoed through that entire studio, Sarah said, she told everyone I was a drug addict so they wouldn't believe me when I told them she was taking out credit cards in my name. The air went out of the room. I've seen a lot of things, but the systematic destruction of a child's reputation to cover up financial, elder, or filial abuse is a special kind of low. I looked over at Diane. Her reaction wasn't shock. It wasn't. How could you say that? It was a quick, darting look toward the cameras, a calculation. She wasn't worried about the lie. She was worried about the optics. She immediately went into a defensive crouch, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that she was just managing the family finances, and that Sarah was confused because of her mental instability. But you see, that's the thing about the truth. It has a different frequency than a lie. You can feel it in your bones when it finally hits the light. I started digging into the history of this isolation. Sarah began to describe a childhood that wasn't a home, but a prison with invisible bars. Diane had systematically cut Sarah off from her father, from her grandparents, and eventually from her friends. She did it through a process we call triangulation. She would tell Sarah that her father didn't love her, that he thought she was a burden, while simultaneously telling the father that Sarah didn't want to see him. She became the gatekeeper of all information, the filter through which all reality had to pass. Why? Because a narcissist can't control an independent person. They need you isolated. They need you to believe that the only person in the world who truly has your back is the one who is currently stabbing you in it. Diane had spent years building a narrative in their small town that Sarah was difficult, unstable, and prone to lying. She was planting the seeds of Sarah's destruction long before Sarah even knew there was a harvest coming. This is what I call preemptive character assassination. If you tell everyone a person is crazy, then when that person finally stands up and says, "Hey, this person is hurting me," everyone just shakes their heads and says, "Oh, there she goes again." Poor Diane, having to deal with that. It's a brilliant, albeit evil, strategy. It creates a situation where the victim is gaslit not just by their abuser, but by their entire community. I looked at the documents our team had gathered. Sarah wasn't crazy. She had been a straight-A student. She had been a girl with dreams of going to university, dreams that were suddenly and mysteriously derailed when her college fund vanished and her credit score was decimated before she even turned 21. Diane sat there and tried to tell me that the money was spent on living expenses for Sarah, but the receipts showed something else. They showed designer bags, spa days, and a lifestyle that Diane couldn't afford on her own. She was literally consuming her daughter's future to fuel her own present. And the worst part? She had convinced herself she was entitled to it because of all the sacrifices she had made as a mother. This is where the escalation really started to boil over. As Sarah got older and began to realize that her mother wasn't her protector but her predator, she tried to pull away. And that's when Diane turned up the heat. Every time Sarah tried to get a job, Diane would have a medical emergency. Every time Sarah tried to move out, Diane would threaten to harm herself or tell the landlord that Sarah was a dangerous person. It was a cycle of emotional kidnapping. The ruining my life narrative was the final weapon in Diane's arsenal. When she realized she could no longer control Sarah through fear, she decided to control her through shame. She brought her here to this stage thinking I would be the final nail in the coffin. She thought I'd look at this unstable girl and tell her to go home and be a better daughter. I turned to Diane and I said, "You didn't come here for help, Diane. You came here for an ally. You wanted me to validate the lie you've been telling for 20 years. But here's the problem. I don't play for your team. I play for the truth." I could see the mask slipping. The poor, tired mother persona was starting to give way to something sharper, something uglier. She started snapping at me, telling me I didn't know the whole story, that I was being manipulated by Sarah's acting. It's the classic narcissist defense. When you catch them in a lie, they accuse you of being the one who's been fooled. We went to a break, and the tension backstage was vibrating. Sarah was in tears, but they weren't the tears of a victim anymore. They were the tears of someone who was finally purging a poison. Diane, on the other hand, was pacing, complaining to the producers about the lighting, about the questions, about how unfair the whole thing was. She wasn't worried about her daughter's pain. She was worried about her own ego. That's the hallmark of this kind of dynamic. The parent's needs are a black hole that can never be filled, and the child is just fuel to be burned in the process. When we came back, I wanted to focus on the blame shifting. I asked Diane, at what point do you take responsibility for the fact that your daughter is terrified of you? At what point do you stop being the victim and start being the parent? Diane couldn't answer that. She didn't have the hardware for it. To her, responsibility was a foreign concept. In her mind, she was the center of the universe, and everything that went wrong was someone else's fault. If the weather was bad, it was because the world was against her. If her daughter was unhappy, it was because her daughter was broken, not because she had been broken by her mother's hands. I started to break down the escalation phase of their most recent year. Sarah had finally found a way to get a small apartment, working 2 jobs under the radar so her mother wouldn't find out. When Diane discovered it, she didn't celebrate her daughter's independence. She didn't offer to help her move. No, she went to the apartment when Sarah was at work, told the manager she was Sarah's mother and that there was a drug issue, and got the locks changed. She literally made her daughter homeless to keep her under her thumb. And then, when Sarah moved back home because she had nowhere else to go, Diane told the neighbors that Sarah had failed and crawled back because she couldn't cut it in the real world. That's not love. That's a hostage situation. Sarah sat there, her voice stronger now, recounting how Diane would sleep in front of the front door so Sarah couldn't leave the house at night, how she would take Sarah's car keys and hide them, how she would call Sarah's workplace dozens of times a day until Sarah was fired for the disruption. This wasn't just conflict. This was a systematic attempt to disable a human being's ability to function independently. Diane's face was turning a shade of red. I've seen many times before. It's the color of a person who is losing their grip on a narrative they spent a lifetime building. She was realizing that the ruining my life story was falling apart, and the person whose life was actually being ruined was sitting right next to her, finally finding her voice. I leaned in and I told Sarah, "You've been carrying a backpack full of bricks that don't belong to you. Your mother has been handing them to you one by one, telling you they're your fault, telling you they're your responsibility, and you've been walking uphill for 20 years trying to please a woman who will never be pleased because she needs you to be the problem so she can be the martyr." I looked at Diane, and you, Diane, you've become so addicted to the sympathy of being a victim that you've sacrificed your own child on the altar of your ego. How does that feel? To look at your daughter and see not a person, but a project to be managed and a scapegoat to be blamed? The silence that followed wasn't just a pause in conversation. It was the sound of a 20-year-old illusion finally shattering. Diane blinked rapidly, her face a mask of indignation that was quickly hardening into rage. The studio lights seemed to bear down on her, stripping away the soft edges she'd tried to project. "I have given my life for her," she spat, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah. "I have sacrificed everything, my career, my friends, my sanity, and this is how she repays me, by telling lies on national television." It was the battle cry of the eternal victim. She wasn't hearing me, she was doubling down. But this time, the audience wasn't buying it. There was a palpable shift in the room, a collective realization that the woman crying crocodile tears was actually the predator. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. "Diane," I said, my voice low and steady, "you keep talking about sacrifice. Let's talk about that. You say you sacrificed your career, but according to the records, you were fired for embezzlement 3 times in 10 years. You say you sacrificed your friends, but according to the people we spoke to, they left because they couldn't stand the way you treated your daughter. You say you sacrificed your sanity, but I'm looking at a woman who seems perfectly lucid when it comes to manipulating the people around her. I paused, letting the weight of the facts settle. The only thing you've sacrificed, Diane, is your daughter's childhood. Sarah flinched as if I'd physically touched a bruise. She looked at me with wide, wet eyes, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of validation. Someone was finally saying it. Someone was finally connecting the dots she had been too afraid to draw. It wasn't just the money, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling but gaining strength. It was the way she made me feel like I owed her for simply existing. Like me being born was the worst thing that ever happened to her, and I had to spend the rest of my life apologizing for it. That hit home. I turned to Diane. Do you hear that? Do you hear what your daughter is saying? She feels like an apology. She feels like a debt that can never be paid. Diane scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, please. She's so dramatic. She gets that from her father. It was a classic deflection. Blame the absent parent, blame the child's nature, anything to avoid looking in the mirror. But I wasn't going to let her wiggle out of this one. I pulled up a graphic on the big screen behind us. It was a timeline of events, a stark visual representation of the chaos Diane had orchestrated. Let's look at this timeline, I said, pointing to the screen. Here, at age 14, Sarah is hospitalized for an anxiety attack. You told the doctors she was faking it for attention. Here, at age 16, Sarah runs away to a friend's house. You call the police and report her as a runaway and tell them she's violent. Here at age 18, Sarah gets accepted to a state university with a partial scholarship. You refuse to sign the financial aid papers because you need her home to help you. This isn't a pattern of a difficult child, Diane. This is a pattern of a mother systematically dismantling her daughter's escape routes. The audience gasped when the timeline showed the financial abuse clearly. Credit cards opened in Sarah's name when she was barely a legal adult, maxed out on online shopping and gambling debts. Diane's face went pale. She started to stammer, I was going to pay it back. I just needed a little help. She's my daughter. She should want to help her mother. It was a confession wrapped in entitlement. She truly believed that Sarah's identity, Sarah's credit, Sarah's future, it all belonged to her. It was property to be used as she saw fit. I looked at Sarah. Did you know about the gambling, Sarah? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I knew she played games on her phone, but I didn't know she was using my name. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just theft. It was identity theft by the person who gave you your identity. It was a violation of the most fundamental trust a child has in a parent. This is the escalation point, I told the audience. This is where the rubber meets the road. Diane, you haven't just ruined your own life. You've mortgaged your daughter's future to pay for your own mistakes. And now, instead of owning it, you've dragged her onto this stage to humiliate her further, hoping that if you yell loud enough about how bad she is, no one will look at the ledger. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Diane. Well, I'm looking at the ledger, and the math doesn't add up. Diane finally snapped. She stood up, her face twisted in fury. You don't know me! You don't know what I've been through. I am a good mother. I have done everything for that ungrateful brat. She was screaming now, pacing the stage like a caged animal. She's the one who's crazy. She's the one who needs help. Look at her. She can't even look me in the eye. It was a desperate, flailing attempt to regain control, to reassert dominance through sheer volume and aggression. But Sarah didn't shrink away this time. She stood up too. It was a slow, deliberate movement. She wiped her face, took a deep breath, and looked her mother dead in the eye. "I can look at you, Mom," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I can look at you and see exactly who you are. And I'm not crazy, I'm just tired. I'm tired of being your excuse, I'm tired of being your bank account, and I'm tired of being your punching bag." The studio went silent. It was one of those moments where time seems to stop. The dynamic had shifted, the power had moved. Sarah had reclaimed her narrative in a single sentence. Diane looked stunned, as if the furniture had suddenly started speaking back to her. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. For the first time in 20 years, her daughter wasn't playing the role assigned to her. I walked over to stand between them, creating a physical barrier, but also an emotional bridge. "Diane," I said softly, "you are losing her. Not because she's bad, but because she's waking up. You can keep screaming, you can keep blaming, you can keep playing the victim, but the jig is up, the truth is out, and the only question left is whether you want to have a relationship with your daughter or if you want to be right. Because you can't have both." Diane slumped back into her chair, deflated. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind only a hollow, bitter woman who realized she had played her hand too hard. She looked away, refusing to meet Sarah's gaze. I just wanted us to be close," she mumbled, a weak attempt to rewrite history one last time. "No, Diane, I corrected her. You wanted her to be close enough to control. That's not closeness, that's captivity." I turned to Sarah. "Sarah, this is the moment where you have to decide not what your mother does, but what you do. You cannot change her. You cannot fix her. You can only save yourself. And saving yourself might mean walking away from the burning building, even if your mother is still standing inside striking matches." The confrontation was raw, ugly, and necessary. It stripped away the layers of pretense and forced both of them to look at the wreckage of their relationship without the filter of Diane's manipulation. It was painful to watch, but it was the kind of pain that precedes healing, like setting a bone that has been broken for years. We were finally getting to the root of the infection. And now the real work could begin. The silence in the studio was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the debris of a collapsed facade. Diane sat there, slumped and sullen, her arms crossed tightly, looking like a petulant child who had been told she couldn't have a second helping of dessert. Sarah, on the other hand, was standing taller. She wasn't magically healed. Trauma doesn't work like that, but the weight of the secret was gone. The monster in the closet had been dragged into the daylight, and it turned out to be just a sad, broken woman with a gambling problem and a personality disorder. I moved us into the confrontation phase, but not the shouting kind. The shouting was done. Now we needed the truth, the kind that cuts deep because it's quiet. I sat down on the edge of my chair, leaning in close to Diane. "Diane, look at me. Not at the cameras, not at the audience, look at me." She reluctantly turned her gaze my way, her eyes hard and resentful. "You are sitting here watching your daughter finally stand up for herself, and your only reaction is anger. Why is that? Why does her strength threaten you so much?" Diane scoffed. "Strength? You call that strength? Disrespecting her mother? Telling lies about me to strangers?" She shook her head. "She's weak. She's always been weak. She can't handle the real world, so she blames me for everything." "Stop," I said, holding up a hand. "Just stop. You are doing it again. You are rewriting reality in real time. But we have the receipts, Diane. We have the police reports. We have the credit card statements. We have the neighbors' testimonies. The world isn't crazy. Sarah isn't crazy. You are the common denominator in all of this chaos. And until you can admit that, until you can say, I did this, there is absolutely no hope for this relationship, I turn to the big screen again. I want to bring out someone who might help clarify things. The doors opened, and a man walked out. He was older, weathered, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the last 5. It was Sarah's father, Tom. Diane stiffened instantly. What is he doing here? She hissed. He abandoned us. He's useless. Tom walked past Diane without even looking at her and went straight to Sarah. He didn't hug her. He looked too afraid to, but he stood close, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I didn't abandon you, Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I was pushed out. She got a restraining order based on lies. She told the court I was abusive. She told me you hated me, that you never wanted to see me again. I fought for years, but I ran out of money. I ran out of fight. And that is my greatest shame. Sarah looked at her father, tears welling up again. She told me you didn't care, she whispered. She said you started a new family and forgot about me. Tom shook his head. I never started a new family. You are my family. I have a box of letters in my truck right now. Letters I wrote you every birthday, every Christmas that came back returned to sender. She never gave them to you. The audience let out a collective gasp of outrage. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the smoking gun of alienation. Diane had not just abused Sarah, she had systematically amputated her support system to ensure total dependency. Diane tried to jump in, shouting over Tom, he's a liar, he's a drunk, don't listen to him. But her voice sounded thin and desperate. The power had shifted irrevocably. The triangle of manipulation was broken because the third point, the truth, had finally entered the room. I looked at Diane with a mixture of pity and resolve. You see what you've done, Diane? You didn't protect your daughter. You held her hostage. You built a wall around her made of lies and fear, and you stood guard at the gate, keeping out anyone who might love her properly. And you did it all under the guise of being a good mother. That is the most tragic part of all. You believe your own con. Diane was trembling now, not with rage, but with fear. The isolation she had forced on Sarah was now closing in on her. She was the one alone on the island. She looked around the studio, realizing she had no allies left. I just wanted her to need me, she whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first honest thing she had said all day. And there it is, I said quietly. You wanted her to need you, but a parent's job is to work themselves out of a job. We raise our kids to leave us, Diane, to be independent, to be strong, to not need us. When you make your child need you by crippling them, that's not love. That's Munchausen by proxy of the soul. You crippled her spirit so you could be her crutch. I turned back to Sarah. She was holding her father's hand now, gripping it like a lifeline. Sarah, you have a choice to make today, and it's a big one. You can go back to that house, back to that dynamic, and try to squeeze water from a stone. You can keep hoping that if you just explain it one more time, she'll get it. Or you can accept that your mother is who she is. She is a woman who loves her need for you more than she loves you. And you can decide that you deserve better. Sarah looked at her mother, then at her father, and finally at me. I can't go back, she said. I can't do it anymore. I feel like I've been holding my breath for 20 years, and I just want to breathe. Then breathe, I said. You have permission. You have the right. You owe her nothing, not your money, not your time, and certainly not your sanity. You have paid your dues, Sarah. The debt is canceled. I offered Diane a lifeline, a final chance at redemption, however slim. Diane, we have a treatment center willing to work with you. Not a spa, not a vacation. A facility that deals with personality disorders and deep-seated trauma. It will be hard work. It will require you to dismantle everything you think you know about yourself. But it is the only way you will ever have a healthy relationship with your daughter again. If you refuse, if you walk out of here today claiming you're the victim, I can promise you one thing, you will lose her forever. Sarah is walking out that door. The only question is whether you're going to do the work to ever be invited back in. Diane looked at the floor. She looked defeated. The ruining my life narrative had been exposed for what it was, a projection. She was the one ruining lives. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. I'll go, she muttered. I don't know if it will help, but I'll go. It wasn't a breakthrough of joy. It was a surrender to reality. It was the best we could hope for. I turned to the audience. This is what happens when we let secrets fester in the dark. They grow teeth. They eat families alive. Today, we pulled the teeth. We turned on the lights. Sarah has a father she thought she lost. She has a future she thought was stolen. And Diane, well, Diane has a long, hard road ahead of her. But at least now, she's on a road, not a treadmill of her own making. Sarah stood up, and for the first time, her posture was open. She looked lighter. She hugged her father, and they walked off the stage together, leaving Diane sitting alone in her chair. It was a stark visual, a powerful ending to a tragic chapter. As I watched them go, I knew that Sarah's journey was just beginning. She had years of deprogramming ahead of her. She had to learn who she was without the mirror of her mother's narcissism distorting her reflection. But she had taken the first step. She had spoken the truth. And in my line of work, that's the only victory that counts. Diane sat there for a long moment after Sarah and Tom had walked away. The audience was quiet, a heavy, respectful silence that hung in the air like dust after a demolition. It wasn't a triumphant silence. It was the kind that follows a necessary but painful surgery. We had cut out the tumor, but the patient was still bleeding. Diane looked small in that big chair. Stripped of her righteous indignation, her martyr complex deflated like a punctured tire. She looked at me, her eyes wet, but this time it wasn't for show. It was the look of someone realizing they were truly alone in a room full of people. I didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice cracking. I just wanted her to need me. I didn't think I was hurting her. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. Diane, intent doesn't change impact. You can drive a car off a cliff because you wanted to see the view, but you still crash at the bottom. You broke your daughter to keep her. That's not love. That's possession. And until you can understand the difference, until you can see Sarah as a person and not an extension of yourself, you will never have her back. She nodded slowly, wiping her face with a tissue that was already soaked through. I'll go, she repeated, her voice barely audible. I'll go to the treatment center. I have to. I don't have anything else. It was a start. It wasn't a redemption arc wrapped in a bow, but it was a start. Recovery for someone like Diane is a marathon, not a sprint. It involves dismantling decades of defense mechanisms, peeling back layers of denial that have hardened into concrete. It means facing the ugly truth that the villain in your life story might actually be you. But for today, acknowledging the wreckage was enough. I walked her backstage where a producer was waiting to take her to the green room. She looked back at the empty stage one last time, a ghost haunting her own life. Then she turned and followed the producer, her shoulders slumped, the weight of her choices finally resting where it belonged on her own back. I found Sarah and Tom in a quiet corner of the hallway. They were sitting close, talking in low voices, catching up on years of lost time. Sarah looked up as I approached, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes clear. She stood up and extended a hand, then pulled it back and hugged me instead. It was a fierce, desperate hug, the kind you give someone who just helped pull you out of a burning building. "Thank you," she whispered into my shoulder. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for making her stop. You did the heavy lifting, Sarah." I told her, stepping back and holding her by the shoulders. "You told the truth when it was terrifying. You stood up to the giant in your life. That took courage I don't see every day. But remember, this is just day one. You have a lot of work to do. You have to learn how to be Sarah, not Diane's daughter. You have to learn how to make decisions without waiting for permission. You have to learn that love doesn't hurt." Tom stood up and shook my hand firmly. "I'm taking her home with me, Dr. Phil. We have a lot of lost time to make up for. I'm going to help her get back on her feet. No strings attached. Just a dad helping his kid." "That's exactly what she needs," I said. "She needs a parent who gives without taking. She needs stability. She needs to know that she is safe. Be that for her, Tom. Don't try to fix her overnight. Just be there." They walked out of the studio together into the bright California sun. It was a poignant image, a father and daughter reunited by the truth, stepping out of the shadow of a woman who had tried to eclipse them both. I walked back onto the empty stage, the lights dim now, the audience gone. I sat in my chair for a moment, reflecting on the day. These are the cases that stick with you. The ones where the damage is so insidious, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that it takes a sledgehammer to break it apart. Diane wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. She was a deeply flawed human being whose unhealed trauma had metastasized into abuse. She was a cautionary tale about what happened when we refuse to deal with our own pain and instead inflict it on the people we are supposed to protect. Sarah's journey wouldn't be easy. She would have nightmares. She would have doubts. She would probably feel guilty for leaving her mother, because that's what victims of emotional abuse do. They internalize the blame. But she had taken the first step. She had broken the cycle. And that is the most powerful thing a person can do. As I walked off the stage and headed toward my dressing room, I thought about all the Sarahs out there, the silent daughters, the scapegoated sons, the children who are carrying the emotional baggage of their parents. I hope they saw this show today. I hope they saw that it's okay to put down the load. I hope they saw that they are not crazy, they are not broken, and they are not alone. And to the Dianes of the world, I hope they saw a warning. You cannot build a relationship on a foundation of lies. You cannot keep people by caging them. Eventually, the truth comes out. Eventually, the bird flies away. And when it does, you are left with nothing but an empty cage and the echo of your own voice. That's the takeaway today. We have to be better. We have to be honest. And we have to be willing to look in the mirror, even when we don't like what we see. Because if we don't, we risk losing the very people we claim to love the most.